can see the link between either the Wagner Group or the Russian Federation to the military governments, in West Africa, and the coups that we've seen in West Africa. Mm-hmm. And these coups have come because they've been weapons, they've been agitation. So that's one thing that Russian propaganda and disinformation is doing in Africa, trying to sow conflict, trying to cause distress, make the people agitated, and if possible, let them have arms just for them to be conflict, and then the Russians see a way for the military to take over.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of On the Edge. Our guest is Nigerian-based journalist and activist Philip Obaji. We speak about the Kremlin's malign interests in the continent, whether it is stoking tensions, flooding the area with weapons to provoke those tensions, whether it is using migration as a weapon of war, or if indeed it is disinformation campaigns that are meant to infiltrate people's minds and the body politic. It's the same old technique that we've seen time and time again all over the globe. For example, back in episode 18, we spoke to Jessica Berlin about what's happening with those self-same techniques in Europe.
The bombs are falling on Ukrainian territory, but the war is already well beyond Ukraine's borders.
Yes, agreed.
Russia is waging hybrid war against all of democratic Europe, against the United States, against all of NATO. Ukraine is a part of a global war against democracy, an attempt to recreate the world order in the 21st century.
So everyone should be paying attention. Let me speak directly to my American audience. If you think this is only happening in Ukraine or, as we see this week, in Africa or in Europe, you're being willfully naive. Of course this is happening in your own backyard, and it can't be dismissed away by simply parroting the Brady Bunch with the whole Russia, Russia, Russia meme, which is meant to distract you. No, more and more people need to be aware of the techniques and the damage that the Kremlin is willing to do anywhere it can create chaos. I urge you to subscribe and share this channel so that more and more people are aware of what they're doing. And of course, also support channels like this week's guest. So, hello, Philip, and welcome to On the Edge. From one front line in the war against the Kremlin to another in Africa, thank you for being on the show this week.
The pleasure is mine. Very strange, from one Philip to another. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, indeed. There's so much to discuss because there is so much where Russia is interfering in the continent in lots of different ways because the continent is not a monolith. But can you give me a broad overview of how the Russians are doing, what the Russians are up to in Africa?
Oh, yes. So it didn't start this year or last year. And I think since 2017, Russia has sought to gain influence politically, economically, and otherwise in Africa. And they're doing it in many places. A lot of people have heard about the Central African Republic and Mali, and they've heard about Russian paramilitaries, particularly from the Wagner Group, being present in these two countries. But before these two countries, there was Sudan, when the Wagner Group showed up sometime around 2017, just to be able to prop up the regime of Omar al-Bashir, and also to do business in the northern part of Sudan in gold. The Wagner Group did set up some companies to mine gold and also to trade gold. But they were also present in Madagascar sometime around 2019, where they helped prop up the candidature of Andrei Rajolina, the current president who contested in the elections of that year. The Wagner Group and Russia, have been present in Libya since around 2017 and 2018, and they're still very much active in Libya as we speak. Russia has got presence in Burkina Faso since last year, and that's one country where the military is currently running the affairs of the nation. The Russians are present in Niger, in West Africa, and that's pretty much the areas where we've seen large Russian presence. At some point, they were present in Mozambique, where they were invited by President Philip Nyusi to help fight against so-called Islamic State Central African Province militias. So they have been in virtually every region of Africa, Central Africa, obviously with the Central African Republic and with Mozambique, in North Africa, obviously with Libya, and in West Africa with Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, and in a strange part of Africa, somewhere around Southern Africa with Madagascar. So it's been Russian presence in these countries. But the influence and the campaigns that the Russians have been carrying out currently, when you talk about propaganda and disinformation, is not just, this campaign is not just focused on the countries I've mentioned, but it targets, more than, say, 30 countries or so in Africa, because you have newspaper outlets in Nigeria, in Togo, in the Ivory Coast, in Senegal, in Cameroon. These are countries where you don't have Russian paramilitaries on the ground, but the campaign, the disinformation campaign, is still targeting these countries because Russia is still trying to see how they can gain influence beyond the countries where they have boots on ground.
You have basically outlined the entire continent there. I mean, that's basically north, south, east, west. It sounds like they're everywhere. What do they hope to gain by exerting their influence on the continent?
Well, a couple of things. And some people will argue this, but I think that they're looking for a new form of neocolonialism, if you put it that way. Because you look at the Central African Republic, for example, you don't have the Russians in that country trying to mine gold and sell gold and diamond resources. You also have Russian officials trying to bring Russian culture into the mainstream of the country. You go to primary schools and secondary schools, students are taught how to sing the Russian anthem. Students are taught how to recite basic words in Russia. So invariably, what they're doing is that they're teaching the Russian language to students in secondary school and in primary school. So they want the Russian culture. This is another form of, Russian imperialism, building up in the country. So they want their culture. They want, the people to believe that Russia is the way to go, But it's not just that. There's also the economic part, which, is the most useful part of the Russians as we speak. In the Central African Republic, we've seen reports that says that since the Russians got there in 2018, they've been able to cut away gold and diamonds worth over $2.5 billion US. So the economic part makes a lot of sense to Russia. It's facing lots of sanctions from the United States, from the European Union. So doing business in Africa, in the Central African Republic, is one easy way to bypass these sanctions, because these resources are not sold officially, but in the black market, in the Gulf region also. Oftentimes they take these resources and then they fly these resources to Russia. So the dealings in the gold and diamond resources in Africa is done basically in the black market. But it's also political influence. The Soviet Union used to have some strong relationships with African nations in the 1950s, 1960s, up till the collapse of the USSR. So, at the time you had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Obviously, Russia lost that strength after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think what President Putin is trying to do now is to somewhat build back that might, that capacity or that influence that the Soviet Union enjoyed many decades ago. And so they're trying to stamp themselves on the continent politically. So that makes a lot of sense to the Kremlin, because it's thinking that if they have supporters in Africa, if they have a stronghold on African nations, then they can always get things done easily on the international stage. We've seen a lot of UN resolutions being backed by African nations, or when it comes to Russia, the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, you see some African nations either voting in support of Russia or abstaining from those votes. So that influence makes a lot of sense to the Kremlin,
Yeah. I mean, it's either the BRICS nation, which of course South Africa is a member of, or it is this idea of the global South, which is made up by includes a lot of African nations.
You're correct. You're very correct, because we're looking at BRICS now.
Yeah.
BRICS is expanding. Now, Nigeria, for example, is a partner nation to BRICS, joining the other 5 permanent BRICS members. And many African nations have been cozying up to this idea of joining BRICS, eventually jettisoning the US dollar and being able to do business, amongst their own currencies. And BRICS is also considering its own currency. So it makes more sense to Russia if they have as many African nations join this alliance.
Yeah. In some ways, I don't know. I'd like you to respond to this. Do you fear that it is just exchanging one form of colonialism, Western, particularly, French or Dutch or Belgian, or, there were a lot of European powers and then subsequently U.S. influence that basically made the continent, colonialized. As coming from Ukraine, which is a colony of Russia, so Russia does have imperial aspirations. Do you fear, or what is your thoughts on the idea that Africa is just swapping one imperial power for another?
That is exactly what it looks like. Because you look at the Central African Republic, for example, was seeing a new form of colonialism. And the country is getting away from French influence. And what are they doing? They're not staying neutral. They're embracing Russian influence, embracing Russian culture, Russian language. They're embracing Russian armed forces, embracing Russian paramilitaries. So what's going on there is very funny, because you go there, you see a situation where even the armed forces of the Central African Republic, all of them, the commanders, the generals, they're taking instructions from the Russian commanders from the Wagner group. So it is Russia having control of the security apparatus in the Central African Republic. You have a national security advisor who is not Central African, but Russian. And everyone, ministers, cabinet members, will always have to go sometimes to the Russians for clearance before they even get access to President Touadera. So that's the level of influence that is alarming, and that makes a lot of us worried about seeing a new form of colonialism. So it's neocolonialism, if you ask me. And it is also Russia spreading its imperialist ideas to Africa. So it's happening in the Central African Republic. It's already happening a little bit in Burkina Faso, because you see the children of Burkina Faso, some of them, not all of them, are getting interested in what Russia is doing in the country. If you watch local football matches in a place like Ouagadougou, for example, the capital of Burkina Faso, you see children reciting the Russian anthem before even playing these matches. So that is exactly what the Russians want to achieve. And just to explain this, in Bangui, that's the capital of the Central African Republic, you have what's called the Russian House. The Russian House was set up by the Wagner Group, is headed by Dmitry Siti, who was a close ally to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Siti, for a long time, ran the affairs, of things in the Central African Republic when it came to Russian, paramilitaries. So the Russian House is aimed at teaching Russian culture, bringing Russian culture to the Central African Republic, making sure the students in primary school understand Russia's ideologies for Africa, and making sure that they understand how to recite the anthem, understand how to speak the language, and what have you. So it's exporting Russian culture to the Central African Republic here.
Well, and the other thing is that wherever Russian empire goes, there is always exploitation. And of course, one of the tragic histories of the entire continent, and in particularly, imperialism and the slave trade and all the rest of it, is exploitation. And we see exploitation in Africa when it comes to gold, when it comes to gems, of course. In Libya, there's oil. When I covered the Libyan civil war, one of the first things I saw was Gazprom moving in to capitalize on the oil fields in places like outside of Benghazi.
Benghazi, for example,
Russians exploit. Do you see Russian exploitation of the continent and its people, propping up, dictatorships, and creating a power structure that exploits the people of Africa? Is that a concern that you have?
Of course, that's what's been happening. Now, in Sudan, under Omar al-Bashir, the Russians went in there, and the Wagner Group, obviously tried to prop up his regime. When Omar al-Bashir realized he was losing grip to power, he brought in the Wagner Group. But they didn't come in for free. They made sure that they set up a company in the northern part of the country. They were processing gold and selling gold to Russian merchants. So that was what was happening. And even after the fall of Omar al-Bashir, they remained in the country. The Wagner Group is still in Sudan. But the country where they have done the most exploitation is the Central African Republic. This is a country that is very rich in gold and diamond resources, but sadly had descended into civil war in 2013. And the only credit I will give to the Russians when it comes to their presence in the Central African Republic is that before the Russians came in, everywhere in this country, except the capital, Bangui, was under the control of either Muslim rebels or Christian militias. So the president, Touadera, invited the Wagner Group, or invited Russia, to come into the country to at least be able to protect the seat of power. But the Russians agreed on the condition that they were going to be able to explore the natural resources of the Central African Republic. The problem was that these resources, these gold mines, over 100 gold mines in the country, were all in the areas where the rebels and the militia groups controlled. So the only way the Russians could gain access to these gold mines was to fight. So they went on massacring people, murdering people, killing people. And they have been able to gain control of the vast majority of the mines in the country. They control most of the mines in the Andaha region, which is the eastern part of the Central African Republic. They control most of the gold mines in the central part of the country. And they're fighting so hard to gain full control of the mines in the northwestern part of the country, which is where you have the Union for Peace Rebel Group take control. And there's a place called Ndasima. Ndasima is in the central part of the Central African Republic. It is very close to the popular town of Bambari. So Ndasima has the Central African Republic's only industrialized gold mine. In fact, the Ndasima gold mine has gold deposits to the tune of about $2.5 billion US. So that's a good, that's big money, good business for the Russians as they see it. So, and the Russians currently control the Ndasima gold mine, and they force local artisanal miners to work there under very difficult conditions. And then whatever gold that is gotten out of Ndasima is either, flown to Russia or to the Gulf region where the Russians have been doing lots of good business. So everything that is made from gold and diamond mining in the Central African Republic evades the Central African states. So it is Russia that is gaining complete control of the exploration in the Central African Republic. And they're trying to do the same in Mali, where you have gold in the southern part of Mali. Yeah, so that's another thing they're trying to do. Obviously, you mentioned Gazprom being involved in Libya. And a lot of people notice that General Haftar, the de facto leader, or the other man who's fighting against the UN-backed government, already has a strong alliance with the Wagner Group. So whatever they do in Benghazi and elsewhere, obviously is to the interest and to the favor of Russia. Yeah.
Well, and they flood the continent with weapons. They're the number one importer of weapons into Africa. The Russians are. So it's almost like they start a fire, and then they come and put out the fire by flooding Africa. Sadly, because of the history of the continent, you send all those weapons over. It's only going to make things worse. So, what are your thoughts on them kind of doing that, sending all these weapons, making wars, making conflict, supporting up, and then coming in and like propping up strong men, and in so doing, the ties between Moscow and these strongmen get worse and worse. What have you know? If you could talk a little bit about that strategy that they use, please.
First of all, Africa has a problem right now with the proliferation of weapons. You know, you have weapons in many parts of Africa, and these weapons are mostly AK-47s. This is a Russian-made weapon. Okay, the Chinese have got license to produce too, and it is in so much supply. You go to Mali, you go to Niger, you go to even Nigeria, not Nigeria, you have these weapons everywhere. And nobody, not even the governments of these countries, have been able to say openly where these weapons come from. But from what we know, these are Russian-made weapons, and also the Chinese also have the license to produce these weapons. And much of what we see, we have faced in West Africa in terms of conflict, whether it's in Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger or even in Nigeria, is based on the fact that so much weapons have come from Libya, which is the area where you have Islamist insurgents and also the Wagner group, at conflict with each other. And the Russians apparently are happy that these weapons are moving across the Sahel. And when you have conflict, it means that you have a problem. Democracy has a big problem where there's conflict. The people become agitated. There's more arms, with civilians than it should be. So at the end of the day, you have a chaotic situation, and then you have the military looking to take over. And oftentimes when the military say we're taking over, it is the Russians pushing them. In Mali, for example, there was crisis in the country, 2020. The people were agitated. They were talking about low unemployment, issues of insecurity, and what have you. So some Malian soldiers traveled to Moscow in January 2020 on military training. And they were in Moscow until they returned in August to take control of power. So as soon as they returned from Moscow, just a few days after they took power, which means they had been planning this coup right from when they were in Russia. Yeah. And in Burkina Faso, before the first coup, the leader of the coup had told the president that they invited Russia, had asked that they invite Russia and the Wagner group to come help the government fight against insurgents. When the president refused, what happened? They took control of power. So you can see the link between either the Wagner group or the Russian Federation to the military governments, in West Africa, and the coups that we've seen in West Africa. And these coups have come because they've been weapons, they've been agitation. So that's one thing that Russian propaganda and disinformation is doing in Africa, trying to sow conflict, trying to cause distress, make the people agitated, and if possible, let them have arms just for them to be conflict, and then the Russians see a way for the military to take over. So as we speak right now, we have about 4 countries in West Africa under military dictatorship, and these countries are working together, especially those ones in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are all working together to create a common entity, a common force, and they're all getting the full support of Russia.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the disinformation campaign because we see that here in Ukraine, and I think it's actually a global weapon that the Kremlin is using. But before we move on, before we do discuss disinformation, I just have a couple more topics I want to talk to you about when it comes to the direct interference on the continent by, in particular, Wagner, but other PMCs, private military companies that Russia supports. They carry with them another thing that they bring with them wherever they go, aside from the exploitation, is the cruelty and the brutality that they use as a scare tactic. We've seen it here in Ukraine in the occupied territories where there are rape squads and there are graphic videos of executions, war crimes. So we know it here in Ukraine. We've seen it here in Ukraine. I know you have reported on this as well, but before I toss the ball back to you, it is not only the brutality and the cruelty that they do, they also do that insidious thing of installing secret police and torture chambers and things of this nature. You yourself were about to be a victim of this kind of torture. But luckily you escaped, and that's an amazing story that you've documented elsewhere. But these two things together, the brutality that they bring to wherever they go, whether it's Ukraine or the CAR, and whether or not it is, physical intimidation and brutality, or whether it is this mental thing of installing a security apparatus which instills fear in everybody because, nobody wants to be falsely imprisoned, much less tortured.
Oh, yes. I mean, what you have seen in Ukraine also happens in Africa. What happened in Bucha, for example, where people were slaughtered and raped, happens a lot here in Africa. And I have listened to quite a number of touching stories. Women have been raped in their farms. Women have been sexually abused in hospitals. In fact, one story in a maternity ward where some women gave birth to babies, Russian paramilitaries from the Wagner group went into this hospital and raped women who had just given birth. Some were still, bleeding just after giving birth. They came in and then they raped them. And we have seen lots of massacres in Africa, in Mali, in the Central African Republic. And much of these atrocities take place in gold mining communities. The Russians do so when they attempt to take control of these communities. So that happens a lot. And then you have people being tortured, for confession, or tortured because they live in areas where the Russians have enemies. And we saw a video recently, a couple of months ago, where 2 people were beheaded. And these 2 people were rebels who really had been fighting against the Russians. So we're told that the people who beheaded them were sent by the Russians. So we've seen such kinds of images, such kinds of footage where people.
And they do that on purpose. They do that on purpose. They videotape it and they show it to intimidate others. It's purposefully done, that kind of brutality and cruelty.
That's very correct. It's like it's become weapons of war. Rape is a weapon of war. Torture is a weapon of war. So, I mean, it's crazy. The sad thing is that people don't have, victims in particular, hardly can find solace anywhere because the government is silent when it comes to this. If you talk about the Central African Republic, for example, the government is silent when it comes to even condemning the acts by these Russian paramilitaries. So if you live in an area where the Russians are present, then you are at your own mercy because there's no one to protect you. Not the local soldiers, not the government officials, nobody. Because these people oftentimes take instructions from the Russians, so they can't even in any way deal with the Russians. So it is really, really huge when it comes to issues around torture, abuse, rape, intimidation. And like you said, even journalists are facing the same, everywhere. I was once...
Especially journalists, yeah.
Exactly. So I was once arrested and detained overnight by Russian paramilitaries and Central African soldiers. I was lucky that they released me, not because they liked me, but because somebody who was senior in the Central African Armed Forces intervened and then secured my release. So it's a big problem, Philip.
Well, you got lucky. You really did get lucky because lucky. Other journalists have not been so lucky.
That's correct.
And that is no joke. And again, this is another thing that Russians export. They do it internally within their own country, but they also, wherever they go, this pattern of intimidation and weaponization happens. Another place where they have weaponized things is human trafficking and immigration, or migration, I should say.
Yeah.
It is well known for there was in 2016 there was a investigation and a paper put out by NATO that they had evidence that the Kremlin was weaponizing migration. And I know you've spoken about that as well. Could you tell us a little bit how Russia uses African migration to put pressure on Europe and weaponize migration by pressuring Europe and by fostering like far-right reactionaries to that weaponized migration?
Oh, yes. Now, let me explain this first of all. Most migrants will move from Africa to Europe illegally, so to speak. They do so through the Sahelian route. So they converge in a town called Agadez. Agadez is located in the central part of Niger. The vast majority of Africans from sub-Saharan Africa who seek to travel by land and by sea to Europe or converge in Agadez in Niger. And when they get to Agadez, they stay in some kind of, homes. There are landlords who rent homes to these migrants. And every Tuesday, they get on vehicles that transport them across the Sahara Desert to Libya. And when they get to Libya, they find smugglers who put them on boats across the Mediterranean Sea to either Italy or Greece or where have you. So it was such a problem that in 2015, the EU had to intervene. And they funded the Nigerian government to be able to stem the migrant flow. So what the Nigerian government did in 2015 was that they made sure that a law was passed, and that law criminalized people smuggling. And people smuggling usually happens in Agadez, where Africans converge, and then they pay smugglers to take them across the desert. So from 2015 until last year, people smuggling reduced drastically in Niger. There was almost no business happening in Agadez. So what happened? When the current military government seized power over a year ago, one of the first things they did, one of the first major decisions they took was to suspend that law that criminalized people smuggling. So suspending that law invariably legalized people smuggling. So we're now seeing many Africans again converge in Agadez. So one thing that we're seeing happening in Agadez is that I spoke recently to some migrants, some people who are fleeing from different parts of Africa going into Agadez. A couple of them told me that they were driven in Russian military vehicles, from different parts of Niger to Agadez, which means that the Russians are even helping to move them from the different locations to Agadez. Yeah, and it's not just that. There's lots of disinformation in the media in Africa. You listen to some local programs in Niger, you listen to some local programs in Burkina Faso, in Mali, where some people or some commentators who are clearly pro-Russian or even paid by Russia are encouraging people to travel to Agadez, where they can find vehicles that would take them to Libya and then find boats to take them to Europe. So invariably, these pro-Russian commentators are encouraging people to travel to Europe through the Sahara Desert. So it's in two ways.
Look, this is not isolated. This is not. Yeah, this is not isolated. This is a technique that we have seen around the world. It's not just Africa, where they're trying to weaponize this so that they get a reactionary rise of the right in Europe. We also, frankly, are seeing this in Central and South America, where they're also pushing. There's direct Russian involvement in pushing, and of course, we see the reaction in the United States with the rise of a right wing, government in the form of Trump, who has used immigration as a weapon. So this is a global problem. This is why I wanted to talk to you, Philip, is because Americans and Western Europeans need to wake up to the fact that this is a global struggle. We here in Ukraine, you there in Africa, we're on kind of the front lines of this. But make no mistake about it, this is global. You talk about disinformation. This is another global issue where the Kremlin is using modern AI and communication techniques, whether it's social media or what have you, to push disinformation. Talk to me a little bit about the disinformation campaign in Africa that the Russians are employing.
Well, it's huge, and they're not targeting the countries where they have soldiers available. They're targeting almost the entire continent, particularly West and Central Africa, and they're trying to paint Ukraine as a bad country. They're trying to paint the US as a bad country. They're trying to paint France as a terrible country. But in everything, I'm very sad at the way that the Russians want Africans to hate Ukraine. That is very troubling because Russia has got many friends in Africa, I must admit. And they've got many sympathizers in Africa. That's very true because their disinformation campaign is, will I say, effective in a way that there are many people who are embracing what they're saying. So, for example, they have Arity, which can be
Russia Today, the broadcast,
Russia Today,
the broadcast channel,
exactly,
satellite channel,
which can be accessed by about people in about 30 countries or so. Yeah, so Africans really can get to watch Arity, from terrestrial TV. So, and Arity is spreading a lot of disinformation, but it's not just Arity. The local media, the local newspapers accept paid commentaries, So you have people who are clearly pro-Russian, Russian agents who pay the local newspapers to publish articles that speak ill about the West and speak ill about Ukraine, just to make sure that Africans don't say anything good about these countries. For example, you have articles that say that the US is moving bioweapon labs from Ukraine to Africa, and the Ukrainians are helping them achieve this. So you have articles that also say that the US is storing weapons in some parts of Africa, trying to create conflict, trying to cause wars. There are also articles that also try to stoke tension and conflict, locally between ethnic groups. And these articles have actually come from people who are aligned, who work for Russia. So I'm deeply sad that many Africans are now seeing Ukraine as a puppet of the West. That shouldn't be. I wish Ukraine can do a lot more in terms of also joining in combating this disinformation because it's growing. And the Russians have looked at the media environment, seeing that many journalists actually do struggle to get any living from journalism here in Africa, and they try to offer money to these journalists to be able to publish Russian propaganda. And sadly,
this is also something we have seen. Yes, we have seen this in particular in America. There was the Tenet media scandal where they were paying influencers because you're right. Yeah. Journalists generally aren't getting a lot of money employed as journalists, so they're very susceptible to it. Is there any? How much do you think that is being effective? Is there any? Look, again, I make the point that Ukraine has been a victim of Moscow's imperialism. Ukraine has been a colonial subject, just as the history of Africa is so plagued with colonialism. Is there how much of that messaging from Moscow is working, and is there any counterbalance to it because of the understanding that Ukraine has also suffered from colonialism? So earlier in our program's run, we had the privilege of sitting down with a member of the Ukrainian Rada, Kira Rudik. We had an episode with her, and we discussed the Global South. And in it, she said,
I remember speaking to leaders of the liberal parties of African countries. They look at the war as the fight between West and Russia was always good to them. But then you ask them one question. Raise your hand if you or your country have a neighbor that always wanted to take a part of you or always wanted to destroy you. Raise a hand if you think that this neighbor would take Russia's impunity as a chance to do the same to you. And then you have a room full of hands, and then you have them listening.
How much of is there a counterbalance, both in terms of understanding that Ukraine has that solidarity with being a colonial subject, and also the concept that what Ukrainians are fighting for here is stopping changing borders by force of arms, which has also plagued Africa. I'm wondering how much these two differing positions are being fought out in Africa, and how is that struggle going?
Well, there's a huge difference between what Ukraine is facing and what Africa is facing. Now, Ukraine is at war. Russia has invaded, and Russia is trying to seize Ukraine. Africa has the Russians, and Africa has dealt with a lot of problems over the years since after colonization, and many African countries are not faring any better. And you have more conflicts now than it was 2-3 decades ago. And many Africans are believing that the overbearing influence of the West have led African nations into conflict. So Russia has come with the message that we can save you from Western oppression. That's the Russian message. We are the answers to your problems. So, and they're spending some monies to make sure that this message goes around. And now many people in Africa are believing that Russia is the solution long-term to Africa's problems. So Africans have a different ideology. Many Africans have a different ideology about Russia as opposed to Ukrainians. So there are just a few Africans like me and some people in the media, some in the civil society, and some who understand the context, who understand the Russian context very well, that have come out to say, no, what the Russians are doing is wrong. They're even worse than the people they accuse of causing the problems that Africa is facing. So the Ukrainians understand much better than the Africans because they are under Russian brutality, so it's quite different.
And Russia has done a good job of hiding. But yeah, I hear you.
Yeah,
go ahead.
That's correct.
Sorry.
That's correct. Imagine what happened last year when dozens of Russian paramilitaries from the Wagner group were killed in northern Mali, and Ukraine said they provided intelligence to the militants who carried that attack. Many Africans became mad at Ukraine for doing so because they believe that Wagner is trying so hard, to keep militants and jihadists at bay when it comes to the conflict in the northern parts of Burkina Faso and Mali. But they forget that the problems, the conflict that's going on in the Sahel has even become worse. It's not better than when the French were there. So the Ukrainians really feel the brutality of the Russians much more than the Africans. So what must be done going forward is that there must be ways to counter this Russian propaganda and disinformation, which I have been going around Europe, going to the US, speaking to people in government, politicians in government, in parliament, in the executive, seeking, some bit of effort, better efforts to help Africans counter Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, because that's what Africa needs. Yeah, and you are facing it in Ukraine. We are facing it in Africa. You can easily feel Russia's brutality towards you because you're killing people. They're trying to take away your freedoms. In Africa, they're not acting, except for parts of Central Africa and Mali. Africans generally haven't seen the Russians act that way towards them, but it's coming. It doesn't mean they won't do so in the future. But there must be ways. And even Ukraine can work with Africa in doing so, And I want to even see President Zelensky speak even more about what collaborations and partnerships Ukraine can do with Africa, because they are somewhat facing a common enemy. They're somewhat in the same kind of situation, even though Ukraine's own is worse. But there must be synergy in terms of how this Russia propaganda and disinformation is fought.
Well, I agree with you 100%, but I'm going to disagree slightly with you in the sense that I think Russian influence and Russian brutality is despicable no matter where it is or what scale it is, whether it's isolated in Mali and the Central African Republic, or, God forbid, it spreads further in Africa, but all Russian brutality should be condemned. So we have a slight disagreement there. Yes,
That's correct, yes. I agree with you, Philip, on that. 100% I agree.
it is, wherever it is found, it is despicable. There's another
Yeah,
issue
I agree.
directly affecting the continent. Thank you. Yes, I figured you would. I figured you would. But there's another issue that is directly affecting the continent because of the war in Ukraine, and that is food shortages, particularly
Yes.
in the kind of what is referred to as the Horn of Africa, with Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia. These places very much rely on food imports from Ukraine, which is, of course, very fertile, but is restricted because of this war. How much is that affecting Africa, the potential of food shortages, particularly in the East?
Oh, yes. Much of Africa, maybe the entire continent, relies on Ukraine for wheat in particular, you know. So we faced a lot of issues with wheat shortage, especially during the early days of the war. And we couldn't get these grains being transported to Africa. So it drove up food prices, you know, especially wheat. And many people use wheat, of course, to make bread here in Africa, and bread is one very, very common food that people always will feed on. So, yes, we have seen food prices go up, not just in one country, Nigeria, you know, where I'm often where I usually stay, but everywhere in Africa. Sadly, many people don't know, or didn't know, and still don't know, that much of this food, this wheat, comes from Ukraine. Many people don't know. So if a lot of people even knew that it came from Ukraine, I'm sure there will be people who will be like, oh, what Russia is doing is not correct, because what you're doing in Ukraine is affecting the prices of food and even the availability of food, you know, here in Africa. So they have been very careful that's talking about Russia and never not to mention issues around food, because they will realize that they will have a lot of people who will condemn the invasion in the first place if what that has happened to us is that it's brought, you know, shortage in terms of food and driven up the prices of food in Africa. So it's not just the Horn of Africa that's facing this issue of food shortage and high food prices. It's also in West Africa and not in Central Africa. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, sadly, another commonality between what we're facing here in Ukraine and what you are facing there in Africa is that it does seem like, as is both of these places' history, greater powers are playing out their designs, both here in Ukraine, but also in Africa. We also, because it's not just the Russians who are seeking greater influence in Africa, it's also the Chinese.
Yeah.
Do you see the possibility of, as both of these powers, the Russians and the Chinese, and as the traditional colonial powers retreat from Africa, do you, because the Chinese and the Russians do not like one another and they may come to conflict on the African continent, what are your thoughts on potentially the Chinese empire and the Russian empire fighting things out or clashing on the African continent to the detriment of Africans?
So to start with, the Russians have been clever as to where they go to. You know, they're trying so hard to pick their places. So they're focused on conflict areas right now. Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, and even Niger. Areas where they will gain more control militarily. So you have the Chinese. Okay, let's look at a country like Central African Republic, for example. The Chinese, by the way, are everywhere in Africa. Whether there's war in that country or not, the Chinese are there. But their presence in countries that are in conflict is not as huge as countries that are, in peace. So in East Africa, the Chinese are very present, but you don't have the Russians there. In Central Africa, the Chinese are very present, but they're not so much in the Central African Republic, because for a long time, that area, the areas where you have the gold mines and diamonds, have been controlled by the rebels. So they're not too much present there. So the Russians don't have so much competition in the Central African Republic because they control everything. And the Chinese, even when the war started, when the civil war began in 2013, many foreign investors like the Canadians and the Chinese began to pull out. But you still have Chinese miners in the central part, but all working based on what the Russians want. So now you go to Mali, and you don't have, the Australians are there, the Chinese are there, and it's only a matter of time before the Russians begin to chase them away. So what will happen in the countries, what I think will happen in the countries where the Russians already have soldiers in, that's countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Central African Republic, is that the Russians, I don't see them facing any opposition, or I don't see them facing any issues at all in terms of taking control, because they have the support of government, so they can easily kick away any other perceived competitor. So the issue will be, if they decide today to go to a country like Kenya, for example, what happens? But again, they are clever. They're not seeking to go into a country that is peaceful. They're seeking to sow conflict and then see an opportunity to get involved. Yeah, so the Chinese go directly and promise investments, promise loans, which African nations are accepting, and then allowing the Chinese to get in and so-called invest. The Russians are not doing so. The Russians are looking at areas where there's conflict and then seeing an opportunity to go in and explore. So right now they're able to avoid each other. And that strategy may continue as long as the Russians are able to get away with this disinformation and propaganda, and able to sow conflict and disorder. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a long history that Russia has, especially also back going to the Soviet Union, where they pretended to be supportive of African independence from colonial powers, but it was really a ploy just to exploit and use Africa as a weapon against the West. I mean, I lived in Moscow. I remember African students who would come to Moscow or other college towns around the Soviet Union, or particularly in the Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they were treated horribly. I mean, as you know, the Russians like to pretend that they're, but it's a very condescending thing of like, these little Africans, and at the same time, they sow this kind of exploitive racism in Africa, all pretending to be supporting Africa. Talk to me a little bit about, have you been witness or heard stories of Russia's kind of brutality and racism in particular when it comes to citizens of Africa?
Oh, yes. I've spoken to
nations
quite a number
around
of
Africa.
Oh, yeah. So I've spoken to quite a number of African students in Russia, whether it's in St. Petersburg, Rostov-on-Don, or Moscow, and they're saying exactly what you're saying, facing deep racism, and they're often the targets when it comes to recruitment. When Russia was looking to recruit students to bash Hillary Clinton during their interference in the 2016 US elections, they targeted African students. And I spoke to a couple of African students in Moscow who told me that officials of RT, the Russian state-owned broadcast channel, had approached them, asking them about being used invariably being used as tools, to speak against Hillary Clinton. So that happened in Moscow with African students. And now we've seen African students being approached by Russian officials asking them if they are interested in fighting in Ukraine. There's also a scheme that's going on currently where, nationals of countries like Uganda, in fact, East Africans being flown to Russia, being told that they are going to be given jobs in Russia, but they end up working in weapons making factories, you get. And there are West Africans, particularly Ghanaians, who were flown to Russia thinking they were going to work in reputable firms, but ended up being sent to the front lines in Ukraine to fight against the Ukrainian armed forces. So this whole actions racist in nature, discriminative in nature, because they have seen Africans as tools in terms of, guinea pigs, so to speak, that they could actually be the kind of tools that could go to war and fight with their lives to keep Russia safe, So, yeah.
Yeah, and they'll do things like even take passports and force them to sign documents they don't quite understand as they're in Russian, and then they find themselves on the front line. But there's also a direct involvement because they set up internet. The Russians set up the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, the SVR. All of those guys, they will set up troll farms as well and pay Africans to, conduct information warfare. Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, yes. So they're using Africans, some of whom are Russian nationals, and some of whom are Russian citizens, so to speak. So what I've seen, is that many of the people that the Russians use to set up online troll farms, and where they also used to recruit Africans who eventually are sent to the front lines in Ukraine. Some of them, or maybe most of them, are actually Africans who left Africa to study in either Moscow or St. Petersburg or anywhere, and they ended up somehow getting recruited by Russian officials, either from the GRU, or what have you. And they use these Africans to engage other Africans in Africa to do so many things. It's not just about, recruiting them to work in Russia or to fight in Ukraine. They use them to carry out the troll campaigns. If you go back to 2016 during the US presidential elections between Trump and Clinton, there was an interference campaign done by the IRA, that's the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which was funded by Yevgeny Prigozhin at the time. Some of the people who were involved in that campaign were Africans. And there were a couple of Africans who created video contents on YouTube where they bashed, one of the candidates, to be specific, Clinton, and where they propped up, the candidature of Trump. So that happened in 2016. In 2020, the next US elections, Africans were recruited in Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, to write articles that were, will stoke tension and conflict in the US. So that's the issue of info warfare, the issue of disinformation. They're recruiting Africans to do so, and it didn't start now, it started a long time ago. Now, the issue of recruiting Africans to fight in Ukraine, which oftentimes is through deception, because they put out those online advertisements asking Africans to, enroll. They'll be flown to Russia, where they will work in either clothing factories or work in different kinds of companies that make soaps, that make whatever. And then when they get to Russia, their passports are seized, forced to sign documents, that they will not, be able to run away and what have you. So eventually that's what happens. And they are recruited by Africans here in Africa and then flown to Russia.
Well, look, as we conclude our discussion, and again, thank you so much for coming on. I just have a couple more questions to pose to you, and you've set me up perfectly here. Because I have the same problem. I have the same problem as you, I think, have, is trying to convince my fellow Americans that we're in an information war, that we're actually in a full-scale war, but it's part of its major front line is the information war. I have trouble convincing my fellow Americans. It sounds to me like you are at least efforting, and I don't know how much difficulty you have doing it, convincing other, your fellow Africans and different, the different nations and communities and populations around Africa that they're also facing this threat from the Kremlin. What can we do united, because we're stronger together? What can we do, those of us who see the threat from a cruel and brutal imperial power in the form of Moscow and Vladimir Putin? What can we do to push back against it, do you think?
First, we need to continue to do what we're doing. And second, we need to get people who are in high authorities to get involved. And it's been very difficult, as you said, for me. I understand your own situation too, but it's even worse for me in Africa, because Russia has tried so hard and is succeeding in making more friends in Africa, than anywhere else. And whenever you speak about Russia's imperialism and Russian aggression in Africa, you get many people in Africa telling you that the West is worse than Russia. So they think that Russia is the better of the two enemies. So what I have done so far is to continue to speak on all the platforms available to me, on Facebook, on X, on Blue Sky, and what have you. It seems to me that I'm having more Westerners listen than even Africans, which is a big problem. And I want to go as fast as I can, and which is to even have conversations at the top level with governments, with parliamentarians, to make them understand this. But the biggest problem that we have is even the issue of funding, because we need to get many, like in Africa, it's important to get many journalists on board. Now, in September, when I went to the US to appear before Congress, to speak on issues about Russia's imperial identity, I made something clear. I said, the biggest problem we have in Africa is the spread of Russian disinformation and the fact that nothing is being done to counter. And Africa needs help in this regard, because it's very difficult to find the funding locally to be able to bring journalists together, to train journalists on disinformation, to inform them on disinformation, and to build their capacity as to how to fact check and counter them. So luckily, I was told in the US that the Africa Center for Strategic Studies was organizing a program on disinformation in Lagos, in Nigeria. So I had to leave Washington, D.C. to Lagos to attend this program, just to be able to know exactly what they were doing. And I realized that the journalists who were part of the program, most of them did not even realize that Russia was carrying out a disinformation campaign in Nigeria. So some were learning about it, most of them were learning about it for the first time in that program. But there were not too many journalists, and most of the journalists are fact checkers. But we need more than fact checkers. We need correspondents to be involved. We need editors. Because regardless of how many fact checkers you train or you make aware of this issue, they have editors. So whatever goes to the editor was not aware, or maybe aware, but it's been incited by money, this propaganda and this disinformation will still fly, if whether or not you train the fact checkers or not, because people can bypass the fact checkers and go straight to editors and then place these kinds of materials, and then the editors are making sure that it's published. So we need to get as many people on board, editors, publishers, correspondents, all together. And I'm trying hard to, make my colleagues here in Africa aware of the situation. But it will take more than me just speaking by phone call or typing a tweet or sending a text message. We also need programs that can make journalists aware of this. And we also need to do more investigations into what the Russians are doing. And that's why I began a GoFundMe recently, to raise funds to be able to go beyond countries like Mali and Burkina Faso and Central Africa, because the Russian campaign is virtually across the continent. So if we cannot bring this to light, it becomes very difficult for the people to know exactly what the Russians are doing.
I agree 100%, and I will add to that one other thing. and that is people like you and I who are fighting this common fight must stay in touch and in solidarity and promote one another and keep these voices going, because on the other end of this conflict, Russia is very good at this. They're incorporating AI. They have a massive program, a sophisticated program funded by the state to do exactly what we have been discussing, and that is to destabilize, divide and conquer, spread disinformation, which ultimately leads in human death. It is not simply cybernetic. It is kinetic on the ground in real life.
Yeah.
So we will include a link to your GoFundMe because you need support and you need equipment and you need everything that we can provide to you, not least of which because we want you to be safe, because there is a threat to your life, I am sure, because that's what Russians do. So let us fight this fight together, and if there's ever anything I can do, all you have to do is ask, and I am at your disposal in any way, shape, or form as well. So let's hope that we can at least generate more defense against what Moscow's up to, what Putin's up to, not just here in Ukraine, not just in Africa, but globally. So, Philip Obaji, thank you for everything that you're doing. Thank you for your work, and thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you, Philip, for having me, and thank you too for the incredible effort that you're doing, to bring all these Russian atrocities and imperialism to light. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. From one Philip to another. Thank you very much. As we say here in Ukraine, yeah.